Hi, I'm Dr. T, and welcome to my office. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about enzyme inhibition. Now, when we're dealing with enzyme inhibition, try to say that 10 times fast, what we're doing is we're looking at how certain molecules, usually relatively small ones, although not always, are able to prevent enzymes from doing whatever the enzyme does. And to be clear, we're usually not talking something that the same cell that has the enzyme is doing. So that's its kind of own kettle of fish. It's very similar in some cases, but that'll be a different video. In this case, we're thinking about things like pharmaceuticals, which act on an enzyme, trying usually to shut it down. So we can imagine, say, antibiotics. Those are trying to target enzymes in a bacteria that the bacteria need really, really badly. And if you can break the enzyme, you can break the bacteria. And that means you'll get better. Alternatively, you could think of something like the proton pump inhibitors, which, Pepsid AC and those guys. You're trying to not break the enzymes in your stomach, but you want to tone them down, make it so they don't run quite as fast. And this is going to be a lot of your pharmaceuticals are going to be doing this, as well as a lot of your poisons. So when we look at these, we can classify them broadly into two categories right off the bat. The reversible and the irreversible. So irreversible inhibitors, the inhibitor binds the enzyme, it's done. It's no longer going to be a functioning enzyme. The cell is going to have to recycle that enzyme. It's toast. A classic case here is actually penicillin. This is going to bind to certain enzymes essential for bacterial cell wall production. And, well, no cell wall, no bacteria, no illness. Yay! Of course, bacteria have figured out ways around this problem and ways to get rid of this particular inhibitor. Irreversible inhibitors will quite often have some general resemblance to the transition state of whatever reaction is taking place. And that way, they're able to bind into it, and then they never really unbind. They bind very, very tightly because the enzyme's active site usually will transition to look like the transition state. Now, normally that's a very temporary thing, so it binds, transitions, pops out. But with these transition state inhibitors, this is kind of the deal. This is where a lot of your organophosphides or organophosphates are going to be interacting, where you've got these phosphoruses that do rather interesting bond angles that mimic transition states. This is going to be a lot of your insecticides, as well as a lot of your chemical weapons. So these are going to be very, very, very nasty chemicals because they are able to inhibit enzymes very well. Other cases would be the poisons in the death cap mushroom, which is a very aptly named fungus. But yeah, so that's the irreversible. Those are usually not going to be ones you would take for your own enzyme. So those would be great if you're trying to kill bacteria. And the way that it kills bacteria is it picks an enzyme, or you have something that's an irreversible inhibitor for an enzyme that you don't have, that you don't need. The bacteria, oh no, it needs it. Okay, so the other class is reversible. So these will bind to the enzyme, but won't stay bound. And the classic one is going to be the competitive inhibitor. So in this case, it once again kind of resembles the substrate, usually looking a little bit more like the substrate than transition state, but something in kind of that category. The enzyme grabs a hold of it. The enzyme does not do chemistry. The enzyme lets it go. So here we can bind the competitive inhibitor, and this is going to slow it down. The classic case is, imagine you're doing some kind of task where you need a screwdriver, and you've got a bunch of screwdrivers, but only one of them's the one you need, and you're rooting through all the screwdrivers trying to find the one you need. Or you're rooting through all the screws trying to find one of them that you need. This now creates this kind of antagonistic relationship with the more competitive inhibitor, the more it's going to slow you down. The more substrate you have, the less it's going to slow you down, because the chances that you run in and grab a screw or a screwdriver or whatever you need happens to be spot on. Classic case is warfarin. Warfarin is a warfarin slash Coumadin. It's the same chemical. This is an anticoagulant. It interferes with the enzymes in platelets that utilize vitamin K. It's actually an analog to vitamin K. And so it's a competitive inhibitor by looking like vitamin K, even though it's not. So in this case, you've got heart disease, heart attacks, whatever. Nowadays we're moving away from warfarin because you have to be fairly careful with it. A little bit of a dosing off and it can kill you because it's also sold as Coumadin, which is rat poison. And so you're taking a low dose of rat poison. Remember, the dose makes the poison. But that does mean, though, because it's competing with vitamin K, if you were to take too much of it, then there's an antidote. Just take more vitamin K. So now you've got kind of this competition with it and vitamin K, which makes life harder, but it does mean there's an antidote to it. By the way, the newer anticoagulants don't have this competitive nature, so they're easier to dose, but it also does mean if you overdose, okay, that's a problem, because we got no antidote. Okay, now, moving on, you've also got the non-competitive and the uncompetitive. They're actually two different things, although conceptually they work very similar. In these cases, everything basically we've talked about so far binds the active site. So the competitive binds the active site, it pretends it's the substrate. The non-competitive and the uncompetitives will bind someplace that's not the active site. And by doing so, they change the shape of the enzyme and they make it so the enzyme can't do its job. And thus it disables it. Now, in this case, it doesn't matter how much substrate you put in there. The competitor is acting at a different spot. There is a difference between the uncompetitive and the non-competitive, but that's, simply stated so as to not mislead you. Not that it's an important distinction. Okay, so in that case, once again, combine someplace else on the enzyme, and that's going to change how the enzyme functions. So yeah, we've got ourselves some inhibitors. A lot of your pharmaceuticals are going to be looking at the competitive and the non-competitive style inhibitors. These are very, very common approaches because quite often what you're doing with pharmaceuticals is you're turning an enzyme down. It's much easier to make one work less than it is to make it work more. There are ways, but very rarely can you do that. So with that said, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video.